Hey y'all, welcome to the Clock Tower. I'm Colton. Today I'm talking about Log Horizon, a set that has never been either significant or good, but I have a soft spot for these old gimmicky sets, and there are a couple of really interesting cards in here, so we're going to talk about it. This entire set does one thing, but it does that one thing well. It stays alive at level 3 because of its anti-auto effect and NEG-SOUL tech. This is not a competitive deck. It's 5 years old, one of the smallest sets ever released, only about 70 cards including the trial deck, very small card pool, most of the effects are expensive, it's missing a lot of the stuff you would see in a modern deck, it doesn't have a lot of early game fixing, it doesn't have a good level 1 combo, it doesn't have a climax swapper, there's just a ton of stuff that this set is missing because it's old. It does, however, shut off a lot of aggressive endgames. Opponents can't hit us with anything from an auto effect, meaning no Musashis, no Icy Tails, and a lot of additional burn damage from climax combos doesn't go through. And also with the NEG-SOUL, if we hit that in 1 lane or 2 lanes, it usually locks our opponents out enough so that we can stay alive for an additional turn, even 2 depending on healing. Obviously, it doesn't work against everything. Things like clock kicks still happen. It doesn't do anything about playing into NEG-SOULs, but it can give almost any deck fits and is almost guaranteed to extend the game by at least a turn. The cost of this deck is complicated. Like I said, it's an old set that was never really in the meta. There are really only 2 expensive cards in the entire deck. The top end makes up about 2/3 of the cost of the entire deck. Everything else is pretty cheap. I think there are maybe a half a dozen cards in the entire set that are worth more than $1 a piece as singles. It can be a little difficult to get a hold of the expensive top end stuff, but with some digging, it's findable, usually at a decent price. There's also a parallel foil set. Every card in the set has a foil parallel, so if you want to bling it out, it's pretty easy to do that, and a lot of the foils are just as cheap as the regular cards. I was able to dig around and basically put together an entire playset for under $200. If you want to dig around, even the expensive cards can be found at reasonable prices because there just isn't a lot of demand for them. Personally, if you find this deck interesting, I would recommend you proxy it. Unless you are a fan, it's really not worth the investment, just because you're never really going to bring the deck out except for casual games. The deck wins by trying to keep hand and deny level 1 combos in the mid game. This deck does not play with a big hand, but it's usually able to get cards back into hand by way of the JCs at level 1, the back row Kanan, and the oversizes at level 0 that stay on board and keep more cards in our hand. And of course the endgame itself, the back row Shiro shuts off auto effect damage, and it gives a NEG-SOUL to our salvage combo, which gets big, wins board, and burns on attack with the climax. So let's get started at level 0. There are basically 2 kinds of cards at this level. One is the oversizes that try to help us keep our hand, and the second is the tech stuff. Starting with the oversizes, we have this Sojiro, sits at 2500, gains 2000 power on an opponent's turn if they have 3 or fewer characters. Basically, it's not going anywhere on turn 1. If we're going first, we can throw this down and it's not dying. With help from some of the other stuff that we run at level 0, it can get up to 6000 power on our opponent's turn. Basically, the idea is we just want to keep this alive as long as we can, because every turn it doesn't die is another card we don't have to play out of our hand to replace it. Next, we run a couple copies of the Samurai Toya Runner, runs to an open slot at the beginning of our opponent's attack phase. Very similar to the Sojiro, it sits at 2500, so on its own it's decent size. Because this can run to either an open lane or to a lane in front of one of our opponent's smaller characters, it's more likely to survive our opponent's second turn. It's susceptible to bombs and it doesn't get as big as the Sojiro, but still plenty big enough to survive at 0. Next is Beach Angel Mariel. This is a profile that's very unique and you don't see a whole lot of. First of all, it gives 500 power to all of our other weapon and magic characters, which is almost everything in the entire deck. It has 2 different on-play mill abilities. One is just on-play mill 3. The second is on-play mill 1. If that card is a climax, this goes to stock. Honestly, not something you can really plan on, and it's almost as annoying as it is helpful for it to go to stock, because usually this is coming down at level 0, and it's coming down because we need to get playables down. But even if the ability triggers, we get a stock. Usually it's not going to. Basically, mills 4 on play, helps mill out our triggers in small decks, helps to fix our deck states if we're out a bunch of climaxes early, helps us time our refreshes so that we're getting the refreshes off when we want to. Overall, really useful profile, especially in a deck that doesn't have a whole lot of speed. The other big source of deck speed is the Brainstormer. Full Control Encounter Shiro is a pay 1, rest 1, draw Brainstormer that gives 1000 power to the middle character when we're on defense. It's a draw Brainstormer, which is fine. It can add climaxes and events into hand, which can also clog our hand depending on the state of the game. It mills, it gives power to the middle character on defense, which means that we can either put the Sojiro in the middle lane, or we can run the Toya to the middle lane, and they're sitting pretty big. Basically, they need to get bombed in order to get removed. This helps us keep board at 0, helps us mill a little bit, and could potentially add to hand. Rudy's owner Isuzu is a drop searcher, and that is what it is. It has an ability that gives power to characters named Rundlehouse, but we don't run any of those. Literally just a drop searcher, and we need drop searchers, especially in this list, because we have basically no other fixing, and we don't have any other stockouts at 0 other than the Brainstormer. So there's not a whole lot more to say about it. It does what it does. It's very necessary. And then finally we have this Renesia. It's a Kanan, which means that it sacrifices itself when another character is put into the waiting room, and we can return that character to the field as rested. It also lets us rest 2 to scry 1 in case we want to know what's on top of our deck. But yeah, basically it just keeps stuff on field for us. We don't have a whole lot of hand in this deck. We don't always have access to playables. It denies blink and level down on that back row Shiro that denies auto effect damage, and keeps our mid game together in an emergency situation. It's also the only character that doesn't have the weapon or magic trait, which is a little annoying because we can't go get it with the drop searcher, and it doesn't help one of our level 1 characters meet its extra power condition. So not being traded is a little bit of a downside, but there's too much value here, and this deck needs this profile too much for us not to run it. Level 1 is all about trying to keep as much hand as possible while denying combos when we can. Most important card is this Nyanta JC. When another character is attacked, we can pay 1 and sacrifice this to put that character back into our hand. Helps us deny level 1 reverse combos, and helps us keep characters in our hand so that we can play them down next turn. We can also rest 2 characters, and this card's soul does not decrease by side attacking, which is potentially useful especially at the end of the game, because we can side, keep it on board, and then use its effect to get one of our level 3 pieces back into our hand. The other 4 we run at level 1 is this Embarrassed Akatsuki. 4500 power, gains 1500 more when we have 3 weapon or magic characters aboard. It's a free level 1 red that gets a little bit of size, which is exactly what we need. It can get up to 7500 on defense if we have both the Marielle and the Brainstormer in the back row, and this is in the center lane. So yeah, this can win lanes at level 1. We can use the JC to get it back into our hand and basically loop it if it's going to die. It's basically just free board presence, and a useful piece for us to have at level 1 just to keep characters on board. Finally, we run 2 copies of Reliable Accountant Henrietta. This is a bonder to our level 2 combo. We can pay 1 to go get the 2-1 that is our plussing combo. Because of when in the game it's being played, we can salvage that character out of what should be a pretty sizable waiting room, guarantee our combo as long as we have the climax. It only sits at 3500, which is not very good, but it's a level 1, it's on trait, and we can also use it just to get a climax out of our stock and a card into our hand, which helps our compression in the next deck. Level 2 is basically entirely about setting up the level 3 game, starting with the 2-1 combo Cleric Marielle. It's a combo on a stock soul. On attack, we pay 1, clock the top card of our deck to salvage 2 characters, and this gains 2000 power. So it will swing at 10,000, which is pretty decent at level 2, as long as it's not swinging into an early play. We really only need it in 1 lane because it can basically get our entire endgame on its own, which is really nice, and we also don't need to get a reverse for it to work. The stock soul basically pays for the combo effect, and if we're paying attention to what we put into our clock at level 1, it's usually not hard to get those targets into waiting room to make sure we can get our endgame together. And just in case we can't for whatever reason, we run this 2-2 event, Dolled Up Akatsuki, pay 2, salvage 2. It's very, very straightforward, gives us additional access to our waiting room on a single card, just in case we don't get our combo together. The last card we run is the 2-1 backup. Silent Worker Akatsuki gives 2500 power. We can also pay 2 when we use the backup to refresh our deck in case we are in a disastrous deck state. It's an expensive effect, but it can save us from eating a bunch of damage and losing the game before we can get our endgame together. And then finally, let's talk about that endgame. It's all about denying damage and hopefully closing with the burn combo. This is the payoff card for the entire set, Log Horizon's Representative Shiro. When it's on board, we can't take damage from auto effects, which as I mentioned before covers a massive swath of stuff. Climax combos, Musashi's, Icy Tails. lots of different combos and off finishers denied by this effect. Also, it is a 1000 level assist, which means that level 3 characters in front of this get an additional 3000 power. And when one of our characters gets a reverse, we can rest this and pay 1 to give that card NEG-SOUL on whatever it's facing next turn. So this card simultaneously provides NEG-SOUL and anti-auto effect damage, basically on its own, keeping us alive for at least one more turn at level 3. The actual level 3 combo is Lord's Ninja Akatsuki. It's a 3/2 10,000 that heals on play. It cannot side attack, but ideally we don't need to anyway, because when it attacks, it gives itself 4000 power when we have the combo down, and on reverse burn. It does have a change effect. We don't run it because it's too expensive, but the point is this gets up to 18,000 power when we have the climax down and the back row Shiro. It will easily get the reverse so that it is the thing that we can apply the NEG-SOUL effect to. So the idea is we play this down, we heal down to 3-0, we deny our opponent's damage so that we stay alive for that additional turn, we keep this alive using the JC and the Kanan, slam down the salvage climax, and try to burn to close the game. So yeah, that endgame is almost definitely going to keep us alive for at least 2 turns. And this deck has a lot of tech that helps us keep our hand together and enough board to continue to build the stock that we need to get those endgame effects off. The JCs deny climax combos, the Kanan keeps our stuff on board, and we don't really need to worry as much about blink and removal because our opponents essentially have to make a choice whether to get rid of the NEG-SOUL that's on the Akatsuki that sits in the front row, or to get rid of the Shiro that prevents auto effects from going off. And if we have the Kanan on board, we can just use that to keep our Shiro in play. So we can deal with a lot of the blink and removal stuff that's running around in the current meta. Unfortunately, just about everything that leads into our endgame is expensive. Our combo is on a 2-1 and it's a pay 1 to do the effect, not to mention the clock. The JC is a pay 1. The only hand fix we really have is the pay 1 drop searcher. So we need to be judicious about when we use those effects, make sure we have enough stock for our endgame. We also basically don't compress except for building stock. The only things we can really do are try to time our refreshes and build clean stock in order to compress ourselves. And this deck can draw so poorly. It can brick really badly because if we don't draw into playables right away, it gets really hard for us to fix our hand. We can fall behind, we're not building stock, and the game is basically a wash from that point. So the occasional really bad brick can absolutely sink this in a way that it wouldn't sink a modern deck. So this isn't so much what the mid-game looks like as much as it demonstrates what our options are in the mid-game. Realistically, we want to be getting the JCs and the Akatsukis down at level 1 as much as we can, keeping field, popping off those JCs, getting cards back into our hand as much as we can. We can also use the JC and the Renesia together to keep the JC on field. There are a lot of interesting combinations we can do there, but the point is we want to get to the point where at level 2, we can get the Cleric combo down so that we can salvage the things that we need for our level 3 games. So we're probably holding the stock soul through our first refresh, which does not feel great, which is why it's so important that we maximize our deck speed as much as possible by dropping those Mariels, those level 0 Mariels that mill 4 whenever we can, using the Brainstormer whenever it's practical to try to draw into another card while also milling out 4, and making sure we attack in as many lanes as we possibly can, building up stock, especially clean stock, so that we can refresh hopefully something in the 7 out of 30 range, which is not great compression, but it's enough so that we're not going to, eat a ridiculous amount of damage and lose the game before we can get our level 3 stuff down. So basically the ideal endgame board looks like this, and what we want to do is on our first turn at level 3, we want to get the JC down. Rest the 2 characters in the back, which are probably the Renesia and the Brainstormer at this point, to give the JC that ability that lets it side attack without losing soul damage, so that it can stay on board into our opponent's turn. Then we play down both of our Akatsukis and our Shiro, heal ourselves down a little bit, hopefully down to 3-0, but wherever we can get that heal down to, we want to get that heal so that we have the best chance of surviving the next turn. We swing with the Akatsukis without the combo because they're still swinging at 13, they're still swinging, for big numbers, and especially for the first player into level 3, we should have targets that we can reverse. We swing with the Akatsuki's, get the reverse in at least one lane, hopefully both. Use that back row Shiro ability, tap it, pay one, to give one of our Akatsuki's the NEG-SOUL. And then on defense, we can use the JC to pop the Akatsuki we did not give the NEG-SOUL to back into our hand so that we have it for next turn. We can use the Renesia to save the other one in case that gets reversed. And then at the start of our next turn, we slam the Akatsuki back down, heal ourselves one more, and then hopefully by that time, we've got the salvage climax in hand. We can throw that down, combo in 2 lanes, burn twice, and hopefully that second turn at level 3 with 2 souls down in 2 lanes, and now a climax combo with a burn, we can hopefully close the game. There are obviously, different ways that this will work out in different matchups. Maybe we need to get a second Shiro down because we need to have more NEG-SOUL. And this is a very strange kind of a deck, and you have to be willing to think outside the box to make sure that the endgame works the way we want it to. But if we can get it all together, we're almost guaranteed to survive at least into a second turn at level 3, and then hopefully get our burn combo off to actually close the game. There are only a handful of other cards that are really worth considering in this deck. Again, it's only like a 70 card set. We just don't have the options. The other pretty popular one that I've seen is the Great Performance Naotsugu at level 3. Sits at 11 with a full board, 14,000 when it has the Shiro. Honestly, Great Performance is just not great anymore because it's so easy to remove. And yes, we could save it with the Kanan, but if our opponent has multiple blink or removal options, or just something that's big and can kill it in the first swing, which honestly 14,000 is just not all that big. We need to have a second Shiro down to the back row, which means that we would not be able to heal down with our Akatsuki's. This doesn't really have anything to protect itself. It's fine, it's not bad, but it doesn't give us that much advantage as opposed to the rest of the stuff that we currently run at level 3. There's also a 2-1 that changes into the 3-2 Akatsuki. It's just too expensive for what it is. On play, it filters one card in our hand. We can basically draw one, pitch one if the top card is a weapon or magic character. But to have to play this, then pay 2 and sack this to go get our level 3 Akatsuki on board potentially early, especially in a meta that has so many things that can deal with early plays, just not worth it. We don't really have the stock for it. Next is the level 1 Shiro that gets up to 5,500 if we have 4 or more cards in hand. The short version of this is that we just usually don't have the hand. We struggle with hand in this deck, which is why we put so much emphasis on keeping hand at level 1, because we need to build the stock by slamming down 3 characters every turn, and we don't really have a whole lot of great plussing options until we get to our level 2 combo. So this card is fine, it's not bad. If the deck had better ways to keep hand, then I think a free 5,500 in blue could be useful, but we just don't have the space for it at level 1 if we can't consistently give it that extra power. And then finally, there's the level 1 Isuzu Bomb. It's just a 3,500 power level bomb. It does kill level 1s, which is really nice in a standby meta where 1/1s are getting up to 8, 9, 10,000 power on defense. This just clears that out. However, because it's a bomb, we lose it out of our hand, and we lose it on field only to clear out something of our opponents. It just doesn't provide advantage for us, and it actively works against us trying to keep cards in our hand. It's useful in contexts, and that context alone might be worth teching it in, but again, because we don't have great fixing, I don't want to have to use a drop surger to get this only to swing into a big thing to kill it and then lose this. It's just not very effective or practical in this deck. So this is the list. Like I said, the whole deck comes out to less than $200, and that's at market price. A lot of this stuff you can find for cheaper if you dig around. You'll notice that some of the more expensive cards are a little harder to find at places like TCG Player. If you Google search the card number, which is LH/ and then the rest of the number, you will find a bunch of shops that are selling that card specifically. You can go through, you can see which ones have it in stock and what prices they're offering. Sometimes you'll get a really good deal on like an Amazon or an eBay listing for some of these older cards. And there's always the chance that you can find some nice foils at a cheap price as well. So that is my recommended way of looking around for these kinds of cards. But realistically, you should be able to get the whole thing for less than $200 if you want to. But again, unless you're a Log Horizon fan or a collector, it makes just as much sense to proxy this, because realistically, you're not taking it to any actual competitions. It's a fun deck, though. It does its one thing really well, and it has enough synergy that it can, pretty consistently get its game together, keep its endgame board, and then hopefully close and get some wins that you might not expect it to get. And that is all for me. Thank you so much for joining me for this deck profile. We will have gameplay for this on Thursday. Next Tuesday, we'll be back with another Clock Talk, and then we'll wrap up 5 cards, 5 minutes for the new Kaguya set the following Thursday. Until next time, thank you so much for joining me, and have a good one.